Before we start, I've just asked Professor Ruiz, how many books did you write? Do you have any guess? I said 20, but he said more than 50. So, in fact, I tried to print out, his introduction in the your graduate center there, but it's over 20 pages. So I have just got 4 pages. Okay. Anyway, okay, thank you so much. It's going to be the last seminar in a series of seminars in this week on peace and climate changes. This afternoon, we have a very distinguished professor from the City University of New York, Tomas Ruiz. He is recognized as a leading authority in the field of United Nations studies, as well as in global governance field. So he wrote many books, and he is also, an influential people in the civil societies, NGO groups. So I think, we have really, distinguished scholar here this afternoon. Recently, he published a book, this one, and this is going to be his subject of talk this afternoon. So we will see, you will get the main, elements of this book this afternoon. Also, we have a group of very distinguished discussants this afternoon. Let me introduce you very briefly according to the order here in this brochure. Okay, the Irina Bokova, the former Director General of the UNESCO, and currently he is the Honorary Dean of Humanitas College of this university. Okay, let's give a round of applause. Okay. All right. And Roberto Bautista is the president of Congress of NGOs, not the country of Congo, right? Okay. And Professor Oh Jun is the former ambassador, Korean ambassador to the United Nations. Okay. And I skipped Won-Soo Kim. We have Ambassador Won-Soo Kim, so former Undersecretary General of United Nations and High Representative for the Disarmament Affairs. He is an authority in the disarmament affairs. So I hope that we can have a very good comment on this matter. And we have Professor Moon Don Moon, currently Dean of College of International Studies of Gyeong University. So we have a very good group of people here, and I have to save much time. So let's have the Tomas Ruiz, the podium. Let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Jen Young. I wish my 2 daughters listened to me as well as other people here. It's a pleasure to be actually back here at the main campus. I spent a couple of summer sessions here, and it's a delight to have these commentators who know at least as much as I do about the topic around the table. And I'm here this week, actually a couple of times a year, at the Graduate Institute of Peace with Jibo and Kwan. In the program it says, "The world without the UN?" A question mark at the end of that. For me, this question is not as preposterous these days as it implies. A couple of years ago, I would have said, well, it's kind of silly. Institutions always go on and on, but I'm actually a little frightened these days. And I'm not very good at mathematics, but in preparing this, I started counting backwards, and I realized that my entire life actually has been spent. It coincides with the UN's existence. Counting backwards, I got to 9, and I found out that actually I had to have been conceived in late April 1945, because I was actually born early in 1946, when the first sessions of the UN were meeting, the GA and the Security Council in London. And in my entire career, 10 years in the Secretariat, NGOs working on the UN, and the last 30 years as a fuzzy-headed academic, but the whole time I've been looking at the behavior and misbehavior of international organizations. So I was delighted when you asked me to address Would the World Be Better Without the UN, the title of the book. And I added a second question because I think it's really, really pertinent, not just for US citizens, but more generally. Would the world be better without Donald Trump? Now, the first half of that question takes 200 pages to answer, and it's a considered and measured no. The latter, I can answer more quickly, as most of you probably can, with a yes. But the argument in the book, for me, is really quite important in actually trying to counter the answer, or maybe go against the answer to the second. So, Trump's remarks disparage the UN, a waste of money, but that's accompanied by a total aversion to any conversation, any collaborative form of decision making. So that's the backdrop for the book and the first part of the talk. The second part will revolve around a different period of both US vision, leadership, and calculation of national interests, namely 1942 to 1945. And then finally, I'm going to end up on First Avenue, America First on First Avenue and the implications. Well, answering the question in that book cover would be essential, frankly, at any time since 1945. But it really is far more critical in the age of Trump. And it's still more pressing with the appointment of John Bolton as the third National Security Advisor. Because what he tried to start, his kind of slash and burn efforts during the Bush administration, he really couldn't carry them out because he wasn't even confirmed as the US Perm Rep. But he now has a much better platform. So both of these characters sneer at international organizations, cooperation of any type, partners and allies are irrelevant in zero-sum ideology. I'd like to try to prove a little later that this is not only ahistorical, but wrong. So my book, and much of what I will have to say, concentrates on the UN, but it really is an attack much more generally on anything multilateral. So, security organizations, NATO's obsolete, costs too much, don't fare much better than trade, where they're disparaging their European Union, Trans-Pacific Partnership, NAFTA, and soon the World Trade Organization. So these are moving ahead, either actively being attacked by the United States or without US participation. But not ad hoc, but anyway, discrete problem solving, the Global Compact on Migration or the Paris Agreement on Climate, don't fare any better than informal groups. The Group of 7, the Group of 20 have now become the G7 minus 1, and the G20 minus 1. And in fact, the minimum number of countries required for multilateralism of course, 3. And even NAFTA doesn't work that way. You've got 2 sets of bilateral conversations, the first one with Mexico, and now with Canada. Now, In case you can't hold your breath, and we only have one copy of the book, the answer, you can find it, Professor Chung, on page 190. And the answer is no. And you might be tempted to say, well, that's pretty obvious. The late Kofi Annan wrote the foreword, so that has to be pretty obvious. But I ask an honest question, and there are two parts of the book. And I try to present what I think are uncomfortable, not alternative, but uncomfortable facts for both friends and foes of the United Nations. So, the structure of the book, and a couple of people actually have read it, but looks at the two main products, or what I think are the two main products of the UN: ideas, standards, norms, for which there are universal application, and then field operations that occur across the world. And I try to talk about examples under the three main types of activity: international peace and security, human rights and humanitarian action, and sustainable development. Part one, I think it would be difficult to argue anything except that the world would be far worse off without the UN system. That part of the argument is, of course, designed for the 45th president and those who surround whom, who have declared war on the rule-based order that we have. So you ask, well, what's the evidence, Thomas? And the evidence, let me just take a few examples. I would argue that we certainly wouldn't be better off without the first UN of member states and the second UN of international civil servants, of whom we have a few X's around the table. Because designing that proposition would involve things like the following. We wouldn't be worse off, for instance, without the cooperative efforts to get rid of smallpox in 1977, and having almost done the same thing with polio and guinea worm. Or more recently, efforts to articulate and sort of push ahead women's rights, to deliver emergency aid in the Congo, not Levy's Congo, but the Democratic Republic and the Sudan, have kept the peace on the Golan Heights or Kashmir or Cyprus, to facilitated decolonization at a much more rapid pace than anyone imagined, have begun some halting steps to protect cultural heritage, as Irina will know, to prosecute war criminals, and the list goes on in the book. Now, counterfactuals are sometimes dismissed as the toys of social scientists. I actually don't think that they are. They force you to say, holding all things equal, what would have happened? So my second half of the book and the second counterfactual are intended for a different audience. These are UN cheerleaders with blue pom-poms in too many UN associations around the world, because there are debits on the UN's ledger, and one has to face them straightforwardly. So it's hard to argue also that we sure would have had a better planet had both member states and civil servants acted differently. If the permanent members, and the elected members actually, of the Security Council had acted with a little less hypocrisy in 1994 in the face of Rwanda, or at present with Myanmar, Yemen, the list goes on. Or peacekeepers had raped fewer children in Central Africa. That's probably a good idea. Or maybe less cholera in Haiti. Or if more dedicated and competent staff had performed better in implementing those field projects, or monitoring independently the misbehavior of member states. And if there were fewer interorganizational battles and more collaboration among the so-called members of the UN family. So that's the second half. And the second counterfactual, it says, if states and civil servants had been more creative, competent, and courageous, we'd be in a better place. When I wrote the proposal to the Carnegie Corporation of New York to do this book, I had in mind that it would come out in 2019 for the 100th anniversary of the founding of the League of Nations and 220 for the 75th of the UN. I thought it was important to tell these stories in just that way, or the way that I try to tell them. But as I mentioned, the task I felt became more urgent because my fellow citizens, are those who are critical, are preoccupied with some big topics: racism, tax benefits for the rich, a tax on the environment, what we spent our last couple of days talking about, and the list goes on. But multilateralism actually doesn't really appear on many agendas, and I really think it should. So, what happened in 2017? Not exactly a great vintage for multilateralism in Washington. It began by cutting totally the funding for the Population Fund, fosters girls' and women's reproductive health. It ended at the end of the year by officially pulling out of UNESCO instead of just not paying the bills since 2010. In between, we had the Paris Agreement and cutting the funding for the commitment to the Green Climate Fund, pulling out of the Global Compact on migration in September, and then ending up the year by actually moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and in a fit of pouting because both the Security Council, although the US vetoed it, and the General Assembly said maybe that's not such a good idea. The funding to UNRWA, the Relief and Works Agency, was frozen, and this year it's been totally cut back. In addition, this year, another bumper harvest, pulling out of the bias cesspool of the Human Rights Council, that's Ambassador Haley's words, ripping up the P5+1 Iran deal, facilitated by the UN, and as I say, moving back to zero now for UNRWA, and threatening sanctions against judges of the International Criminal Court should they dare to begin looking at any behavior or misbehavior by US citizens or allies anytime in the future. So, my main concern is that the shots across the bow of multilateralism last year and so far this year are going to become broadsides. I think that the sort of funk at the G7 and NATO summits is going to be followed next week with the encore for the General Assembly and Trump presiding over the Security Council with some real fireworks. I hope I'm wrong. So, United Nations is not a four-letter word, but the UN acronym is a two-letter invective these days. So, let me now try to put his remarks last year at the General Assembly in some kind of historical context, because it hasn't always been that way. We kind of forget that. Let me start with a quote from a dear friend of mine, I think one of the people with the most integrity who's been in the UN, Sir Brian Urquhart. When I was doing an oral history interview with him, he said, "My dear Tom, the real problem is that the UN is the last bastion of state sovereignty." What Brian had in mind was, of course, the rescue of human beings caught in the crosshairs of violence, human rights abused. The Secretary General mentioned the 70th anniversary forthcoming of the Universal Declaration. But what Brian had in mind was that presidents, princes, prime ministers basically justified doing anything behind their national borders, saying that's our business. And member states for a very long time assented. More recently, on occasion, the license for mass murder has been taken back with an occasional implementation of the responsibility to protect. There are treaties, about 560 of which are deposited at the UN. And of course, globalization means that in terms of technology, ideas, financial transfers, states cannot actually halt certain kinds of invasions. So everyone students in the room who are studying international relations, you'd have to say somewhere in one of those books, I hope it says, sovereignty ain't quite what it used to be. Trump's speech last year used the S word 21 times. Now, even for a redundant speaker, that's a remarkable record. His mantra, of course, was received very well, with lots of applause, by such human rights champions as China and Russia and Myanmar and Venezuela and Cuba and Zimbabwe. Those folks customarily, or in the past, used to use sacrosanct state sovereignty as a way, or emphasize it, as a way to fend off criticism. That's no longer the case, because now they have a permission slip. So far, Trump's efforts to sort of rely upon the power of one to address problems clearly fly in the face of the reality of problem solving. You can't tend your garden only in 2018 or 19. And it also ignores where, as I said earlier, UN and other cooperative ventures have really truly made a difference and had benefits for the United States and everyone else. Now, I'm not the only analyst to recall the namesake of America First, which was actually the largest and best organized and best financed anti-war movement of all time, established by the proto-fascists Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh and Father Coughlin to keep the US out of World War II. That committee didn't last very long. It lasted less than a year. Trump's version has not as yet. It will, and I hope it doesn't require Pearl Harbor to do so. So, the paradox at the end of the second decade of the 21st century is that the UN is the logical place to convene conversations, orchestrate certain kinds of actions, not all action, but certain kinds of actions, which national efforts simply can't address. Let's face it. At the same time, its limitations, sovereignty-bound institution, and atomized, fragmented, wasteful operations are also pretty obvious. Before I try to go to those things, I wanted to just, as I say, put remarks by Trump last year and this year in a historical context. Because while Trump and Bolton don't think, they've never met an ally or an institution that they like, there was another existential crisis, fascism from 42 to 45, and I conducted a major research project called the Wartime History and the Future United Nations. And I just want to briefly go back to that period, because calculations about national interests are always important, and calculations about national interests at that time in Washington, in Whitehall, and lots of other places involved multilateral calculations, not just national calculations. Now, the real birth of the United Nations was on the 1st of January, 1942. I know October 24th is Korea's holiday. I was told that today, I'd forgotten that. And that's the entry of the charter into force. But the 1st of January, 1942, in Washington, D.C., 26 allied nations, later it became 44, signed something called the Declaration by United Nations. Obviously, this was intended to crush in the short term Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But in the longer term, it was to maintain international peace and security and foster post-war stability and prosperity. So, the commitment was obvious in the Asian, European, and African fronts, but it was also evident, actually, in national policies and coordination among the allies. So, this mixture of realism and idealism we often forget about this. It's sort of totally set aside. The Cold War and everything stopped. This was a critical, as I say, an existential moment. And US military muscle was obviously on display, but so was multilateralism. This was integral to decision-making during World War II. And so recently, or more recently, somebody like Michael Mandelbaum would say, we don't do social work. That's not foreign policy. Or Condoleezza Rice would say, we don't escort children to kindergarten. That's not foreign policy. Well, in fact, that kind of social work was really critical to success in World War II. The US commitment to decolonization, international criminal justice, post-war reconstruction, refugee assistance, international development, regulating economic activity, public diplomacy, agricultural and educational policy, all this stuff is throughout all of the preparatory documents for San Francisco and in the archives of the war. In short, the planners rejected unilateral military might and lawlessness as policy options. So, multilateral was not peripheral. This was not a temporary sleight of hand and to be thrown out when the going got tough. It was central. And while one might have thought that the failed League of Nations, without the participation by major powers, in particular the United States, would have led to something like Hobbes on steroids, it didn't. Multilateralism and the rule of law, not going alone, and the law of the jungle were what were on the table. So the bottom line at the time was really straightforward. It wasn't a return to 1913. It wasn't 1914 minus, even without a toothless league. It was 1918 plus. What do we do to build on that experience and improve it? So, the members of the administration, well, I shouldn't say forgotten the lesson. They probably never studied the history. But while the logic is that middle powers, the Koreas of this world, purportedly prefer multilateralism, and major powers prefer unilateralism, the wartime origins suggest that that isn't necessarily so. When the political conditions and the leadership is right, a different kind of calculation, a different kind of vision is exercised. So what are the implications for America First on First Avenue and elsewhere? Well, the first thing to say is that the age of Trump, he's not alone. In addition to Brexit, we've got the age of Putin, Erdogan, Xi, Modi, Duterte, El-Sisi, Maduro, Orban, Obrador, and it goes on. Still, as I say, not only as a US citizen, but as a citizen of the planet, I think it's important to see what the most important funder and, alas, most important political actor can do, because it can really wreak havoc in financial and political terms. So you can't ignore either the rhetoric or the action, and both are loud and clear. So those initial cuts, UNFPA, actually more significant ones to peacekeeping, but the US share ended up being 170 million or something. Even cutting everything to UNRWA, we're talking about at most 550 or $600 million, a rounding error in the US budget, but this has huge impacts on the UN and the UN system and on its morale. What's actually been forgotten to date is that other donors are not jumping in to pick up the tab, let's face it. And in fact, Beijing and Moscow have used this to say, well, there are other ways to save money. In particular, we should eliminate human rights in peacekeeping operations. How's that for that's a good way to make savings. So, but in addition to these actions in the UN, the actions in the trade and environmental arena outside the UN are telling illustrations, I think, of worse things to come. So, tearing up the TPP and threatening to do the same with NAFTA. Hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it will, but anyway. and slapping on tariffs and has played directly, frankly, into the hands of China and, to a lesser extent, Russia. Both have long sought to divide the West, but they no longer actually have to do this for themselves. They have the Trump administration to drive the wedges. It seems to me that Beijing has probably made the most of this kind of opportunity presented on a silver platter. Pick up new trading partners, get to fixed standards, become the champion of stability and free trade. While Washington seems intent on starting a trade war and being totally unpredictable, I think it was given not just the conversations the last 2 days, but in general, the pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement has also played into China's hands in the sense that, ironically, after 4 years of record-setting temperatures and fires all over California and everything else, and on the period when China has become the largest producer of greenhouse gases, and there are several cities where it's not recommended to breathe, they become the champions of green technologies, dominating the market, about 3/4 in solar panels and lots of other things. So meanwhile, the Trump administration is finding jobs supposedly in coal mines and getting rid of environmental regulations. Obviously, this is not going to make America great again, although there's a good chance it can make it polluted again. Fortunately, and we were talking earlier, I'm trying to behave myself because I was so wrong in 2016. I'm guardedly optimistic about November 6th. But it's important to keep in mind that the 2020 presidential election will occur actually a few days before the 4-year legal limit on the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. Let's hope that more U.S. electors will have come to their senses. But in any case, the commitment actually by many U.S. cities, by 16 states and Puerto Rico, and a huge number of really important corporations to stay with the restrictions of the Paris Agreement are critically important. Mike Bloomberg's "We're Still in" coalition, Jerry Brown's conference in San Francisco. It's really quite important that, that California's economy is bigger than the one in the country where the Paris Agreement was signed. So this is not trivial. So, after all this, Thomas, can the UN remain relevant? Or is it doomed to become more and more marginal, kind of a fossil on the international scene? It's important to recall that reform has been a perpetual task ever since the ink was drying on the charter. We talk incessantly about making it more inclusive, transparent, accountable, to pull together the excessively large number of more and more moving parts. And I think I have to be kind here. These efforts have not brought much. Uneven at best. I think they have to become much more substantial and soon. And while the decibel level in Washington is increasing, that's not the only place. I spent much of last year doing, at the request of the Swedish Parliament, an evaluation of Sweden's aid to the UN. Sweden, those good guys in the north, who almost never ask any questions. They pony up the money. Their parliament, their citizens are asking tough questions. So the multilateral narrative has not only much less resonance, much less visceral appeal than it did in 1945, much less than it had a few years ago. So it seems to me that this is where my effort to say the world without the UN has some potential traction. A couple of illustrations I think should help. If you look back at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you look at the archives, both Kennedy and Khrushchev, the president and the secretary, the general secretary, give the largely unsung efforts of Entente a huge credit for having kept a lid on that cauldron. Now, that obviously wasn't the only factor in that. Let's be serious. But it was important, and I think it's important to say, well, do we really want to test the proposition that it's irrelevant, that we don't need certain kinds of good offices in fact-finding? Earlier I mentioned smallpox. You go back, the entire eradication of the smallpox effort cost $300 million, of which only $100 million was WHO measures, of which the US contribution was only about $35 million. That was 1/3 the cost of one fighter jet in 1977. So if you're trying to say cost benefits, billions of dollars of years in administrative costs, storing vaccines, not to mention the suffering from that scourge. So this is the kind of thing I think we're increasingly going to have to do to emphasize the value for money that cooperation and the UN present. So what does this mean for the Secretary General? It seems to me that in the longer term, global instability signals that the UN is going to have to be looking at its comparative advantage. I don't think this is operationally in all kinds of developing countries. I think it's going to be operational in a few war-torn or conflict-prone countries. The emphasis is going to be really, I think, on pooling efforts of partners, having conversations about pulling these efforts together, what kinds of universal standards need to be implemented. That's down the road, but I think what's much more feasible and has not occurred is to address what I earlier said was the waste overlap and lack of synergy in the UN and its system of organizations. Now, high-level panels, academic treatises, international commissions, the media have underlined the fragmentation since Sir Robert Jackson did his 1969 evaluation of the UN system, which he called a lumbering prehistoric monster. And here we are, almost a half a century later, and the dinosaur is not more adapted to the contemporary climate. And I think actually the Secretary General, 2 years into a 5-year term, the honeymoon should be over. He's certainly not unaware of the flaws, the shortcomings, both structural and political. I just hope that he soon finds the fortitude not to shy away from the task, and I think of transforming, and that's the word, transforming the way the UN does business. So, is there a silver lining? Is it possible that the tightening of financial screws by the US could actually allow him to do what's long needed to be done? Let's hope so, because it seems to me if he fails, there's going to be an additional self-reinforcing logic that multilateralism doesn't work, it's not worth the pain, the costs far outweigh the benefits. And then we're going to have a real-time proposition that we could actually be worse off without the UN. Let me just close, that's pretty close to your 30 minutes, okay, by reminding us of, I overuse this quote, so does everybody else, but I think it's important. The Hammarskjöld quote about UN wasn't created to get us to heaven, but to save us from going to hell, or something like that. Actually, one reason that we're not already in the netherworld have been some of the successes that I try to point out in the book, and there are others. But a world without the UN is frankly no longer not unimaginable. And if political conditions continue or worsen, as I say, we're going to have a real-time test of that. Indeed, I think there may be an additional danger of taking the institution for granted. Kevin Rudd, who was running for Guterres' job, had this to say, but I think it's really actually very, very apt. We are barely conscious of the continuing stabilizing role the UN plays in setting the broad parameters for the conduct of international relations. He continues, if one day the UN disappears, or more likely, just slides into neglect, it is only then we would become fully aware of the gaping hole this would leave in what remained of the post-war order. So, the proposition in this book is that, warts and all, the UN remains essential. The last line of Trump's speech in 2017, I haven't quoted him, so I better. What he said was, we are calling for a great reawakening of nations. He somehow overlooked the fact that the United States and the Allies created the UN to curb the demonstrated horrors of nations and of nationalism. You know, instead, it's not going to happen, but it'd be nice to hear his last line, or maybe ours, calling for a great reawakening of the United Nations. I'm going to stop there.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Yesterday, at the end of, almost the end of the roundtable session, I've got to know that many discussants here have lots of questions on the global governance issues. That's the reason is very simple, right? We have very globalized problems, certainly, I mean, including the climate change issues. But as he mentioned, we are living in a world where many important political leaders and countries are talking about a reawakening of nationalism, or taking sovereignty or control back, kind of, you know, slogans we are familiar with nowadays. So where is going to be the balance between what you said, some strong kind of multilateralism, and on the one hand, on the other hand, some, you know, reawakening nationalism? That's, I mean, a very fundamental question, I guess. So let me turn the microphone to our commentators. Can I follow this order? Madam Bokova is okay with you?
Yeah.
All right. So we go to the scheme and then. Okay, let's start.
Thank you very much, Professor Chung, and thank you, Thomas, for the book, for the talk, because it is so full of analysis, of facts, of concerns that, frankly, I don't know where to start from. But let me say that
say some nice things.
It's a fascinating story. Yes, I will say nice things, definitely, and maybe just a few questions. I probably have the privilege, like I think some of the friends here, to be within the United Nations, to work there. I have been on both sides. I have been on the side of a member state. I have been on the side of the Secretariat. I have been one of those barons, as you put it in the book. I would call baroness, if you allow me, not just barons, because there are women already leading agencies in the United Nations, and you should allow women also to lead the United Nations at some point. But I think the underlying concern that we all have is really the sidelining of the United Nations in this globalized world that is, as we all say, that it's full of opportunities and global challenges, and there is lack of governance. Now, probably one of the reasons is that United Nations cannot do everything, and it's also a matter of perception that and how to manage expectations. It's a very political kind of thing, you know. In national politics, also one of the roles of politicians is to manage expectations. And this is also the problem of the United Nations, that we expect that United Nations solve all problems, that it does everything. And we know that United Nations cannot do everything, but it should do some of the things that it has been established for, to do it right, or at least to aspire to do it right. And from that point of view, I totally agree with you, and the quote of Kevin Root was very appropriate. Sometimes we don't even imagine the myriads of impact that the United Nations has had. I can speak for the organization that I was leading, UNESCO. It's a huge convening power. It's a huge normative setting, starting from the beginning when it was established, the first international organization to be established. And without this global effort, there would not have been the global effort of education for all. There would not have been the huge scientific effort, because renewable energies were born idea at UNESCO, not to speak about the myriad of institutions that were launched, starting with culture, ICOM, International Council of Museum, which is a huge organization, and probably ending with the normative setting. And I think it is very important, because those norms that have been established by the United Nations, all these international agreements, at the end of the day, make what we speak here in Kyungshu University the civilized world, right? This is what is the basis of it. And of course, the big ideas, the ideas that have been born and then launched into the space. So I think it's really preposterous sometimes even to think that we could have lived without UN, without this broad platform of problem solving. Now, of course, it is, and I didn't hear this word in you, it is about diplomacy. And we have forgotten that diplomacy, multilateral diplomacy, it's a very hard work. It does not happen overnight. I mean, ambassadors here know. It's really hard work in order to produce a document, to negotiate, to reconcile, to convene all countries around certain idea. And I think this is very important. Nowhere else this can happen than in the United Nations. And I think the Paris Agreement is a very good testimony to that, because I remember what a huge work was done, not least by the French diplomacy. We have to give credit to them for convening small and big and conflicting. So it's really a hard work, and it has to be recognized. Now, two more issues, because I think it's very interesting, but I don't want to take all the time. There are many ideas that I would like to share with you. Now, I think the problem with the governance, it's a huge problem in the United Nations. Before even I was elected, it was just finished when I started with the big external evaluation, not evaluation of the organization, that was done by the external evaluators. And there were 5 big areas that I had to look at, 4 areas and 1 for member states. It was about our working with the other UN system, it was about our presence on the field, it was about focusing, and the 5th was about governance. Because at UNESCO, we have 46 different councils, committees from member states that are governing different programs. It is not just the Director General that implements decisions. We have the Biodiversity Managed Biosphere Reserve Governing Council. We have the International Hydrological Program Governing Council. We have committees. We have myriads of things. And when it came to member states to take up the governance and to discuss it, there was a total deadlock. And nothing happened, albeit I tried to push. So the question of the governance is critical. It is critical also for the coherence of the system. The reform that we all want to do, how to work as one within the United Nations, will not happen if member states will not look at the governance. The governance of the specialized agencies is very different from the governance of a fund or a program. I have my own budget, I have my own decisions, I report to the General Conference, to the Executive Board, the QCPR, I'm looking at Ambassador Ojun, who was chairing ECOSOC, and he knows, and the famous comprehensive policy review. I just looked to see what was the name of these resolutions. We were looking at how the agencies worked wide in the United Nations system, did not include the agencies. It was only about funds and programs, and we were sidelined from this. So from that point of view, I think there is a huge space for reform, for looking to encourage member states to take up and to look at that from the perspective really of delivering. And then, and I will end with that. Now, I do believe that in the global context, the common good is being lost. And I think the United Nations were created, like many other organizations, to, of course, on the basis of national interests and sovereignty. This will stay with us. But to look at the common good and to try to give in something in order to find this common good. So this is being diminishing. It is slightly disappearing. And I think it is not just the UN that we witness it globally. We witness it with, you spoke about the US politics, we see it in Europe, we see it in some other countries, in some other regions. And I think here the United Nations should try and to find out once again to get back countries around the notion of a common good for humanity. And we have things here. The climate change that we have discussed here, I think this really should transform this common glue in order to mobilize around this common challenge, this idea, Agenda 2030, and many of the very, I would say, forward-looking narratives that and concrete ideas that the United Nations has done. It's important, not least, because as you say in your book, United Nations nowadays is not just governments and representatives, it's myriads of partners and myriads of civil society, of private sector, of intellectuals, of organizations that are around, professional and others, who feel also part of the United Nations. So how to mobilize this huge energy is also a big challenge for the United Nations. So I just would like to share your feelings, sometimes frustrations from the book, but definitely there is no other way forward. We just need the United Nations. It has to be reformed. It's normal because life changes and you have constantly to adapt to the outside world. There was no this type of development. There is not still in the charter, right? But we have taken this huge agenda because it's the imperative of the world. So how to look with the contemporary eyes and how to modernize from that with member states should be also I think the agenda both for the Secretary General or leaders of the organizations and others. The key, of course, is working with member states.
Okay, Tom, let's treat the former Director General of UNESCO first. Okay, you respond. No, you want to wait?
You want me to, you know, we've got lots of people to say lots of things. I mean, if we get into a conversation, nobody else in the audience is going to get. I'm happy to, but do you think it would be better to get some other folks into the conversation?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And then I can avoid questions more easily.
All right.
Yeah, so.
I will follow you. Bastion.
Thank you. I think our challenge is to how to manage our time, so that also
You
audience.
have about 7 minutes.
Audience, maybe I will try to maybe even spare a couple of minutes from 7 minutes, because Irina already said it much. I'll just make 3 points. First point, as Irina said, I agree with your counterfactual conclusion that UN world will be, I think, far worse off without the UN. And that is pretty clear to us because for the last 70 years, UN has served not only as a global forum to create or establish global norms, standards, even voluntary code of conduct, but also as the provider of global public good. Peacekeeping is is one such example. I mean, what UNESCO is doing, the same thing. So at UN, we just pick up 10 big things we are doing every day. If I give you just 2 examples, is UN is feeding over 100 million people, not a week, not a year, every day. And we are protecting now 68 million refugees every day. And UN is filling the gap created by government failures, our member states' failures. And without UN, I don't see any possibility this critical service provision can be taken up by any other player. So that first conclusion is pretty obvious. And also, I agree with Thomas that, of course, UN can be made much more relevant and much more effective. And as one of the previous Secretaries General said, UN is created with ideals in heaven, but maybe its rules, bureaucracies, governance structures, maybe written in the hell. Because on many occasions, I found our own member states, first to UN, as Thomas said, are schizophrenic about what they want from multilateral institutions. On the one hand, they want very strong compliance and provision of justice, human rights, accountability. But on the other hand, those same governments are trying to block what UN is trying to do. So there is a room, I believe, UN can make, by UN I mean all international organizations, international system consisting of at least maybe 40 international organizations, including Bretton Woods. And they are still, given the current international situation described by Thomas, I'm skeptical about any meaningful governance reform for now. But I think there is a lot of room. We can do better for secretariat reform. And UN system is forced to deliver same services with much less resources. If I give you one example, UN peacekeeping is already very cost effective. We are spending like $8 billion a year in 16 operations. And that amount is just, I think, maybe 10 days or less than 2 weeks of what US spent in Iraq. US is spending so much money for one country, but UN is doing for 16 countries with just maybe 2 weeks of the money they are spending with US forces. So we are already, I think, quite cost effective. But because of the cut, Thomas said, on UNRWA, UNESCO, and UNFPA, and given the increase of refugees and other humanitarian needs, UN system is already asked to deliver more with less. So there is no other alternative for UN system with greater efficiency and effectiveness. So I think it is a must, and I think UN system will adapt itself to it. And so my last point is about a partnership. Because of my skepticism for now about missing global leadership from critical member states, I have far less faith in what first UN member states can do, although, as Irina said, member states is our shareholders, and we have to follow their orders. Mm-hmm. But still, I don't think leadership will come from them. So in the meantime, what UN system can do is to improve partnership between second and the third UN, as Thomas said. Secretariat, International Civil Service, and civil society. So I think the coming up with all stakeholder partnership backed by innovative financing to be aided by the private sector, I think it can be the way forward until we have a better global leadership coming from the member states. So I will stop here. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ambassador Kim. Let's turn to the Roberto. It's your turn. Then Gary. Okay.
There's too much going on in my mind. I look forward to reading, which means to say that I have only skimmed through the book of Tom, but it's something that I look forward to doing. I've forgotten the full name, Ambassador Hamid, when he was of Malaysia, when he was the chair of ECOSOC in my first term as president of Congo, of the Conference of NGOs. I invited him to a symposium of Congo leaders. I was looking in my cell phone the exact quote, but instead of losing time, I'll paraphrase him. And what he said is, we need you NGOs, because what we diplomats want to say, we cannot say. We want you to be the one saying it on our behalf. That's good. That's good to hear as an NGO leader. But I think there is a deficit within the United Nations system from both the first UN as well as the second UN that Tom, in the terms that Tom used here, that while secretaries general, from start to finish have all extolled the virtue of the participation of NGOs, but I think there's a big deficit in the way the third UN, and the third UN, even in Tom's description, is far larger than the imagination of Congo, of its membership, because Congo's membership still does not include chambers of commerce. It does not include quasi-NGOs that are actually local government units, and they come to the UN. Think tanks that have recently gotten ECOSOC statuses. This is really the third UN, which is almost like at its widest expanse what governments need for the partnerships that Ambassador Kim talks about. And yet, they are underserved, their access of the UN. The Assembly of Congo in Geneva, where I was elected this March as president again of Congo, the only resolution that we approved was the one on UN funding, that we decry the decreasing funding of the core budget of the United Nations. And the reason, not simply for the reasons that the United Nations need all the money it needs for all the things we want the UN to do. And put negatively, the things that we want the UN to do is also the same reasoning we give for our criticism of the UN, that why should we support the UN when it keeps failing to do this, and yet we do not fund our values. We critique it for not demining faster than we want, and yet we keep dry the pockets from where monies for disarmament is needed. And so the Congo Assembly issued a statement that yoked the effect of UN funding on NGO access. So when you're talking about efficiencies of the second UN, meaning the international public servants, the Secretariat, the Human Rights Council very recently made an announcement and said, because of decreased funding to the Human Rights Council, we will reduce the number of days for general debate. Translate that concretely for NGO, it means access. the number of hours for the intervention of NGOs during the Universal Periodic Review are effectively reduced, because the reduction in budget, according to the Office of the High Commissioner, meant a reduction in staff and a reduction of the number of hours which available staff can manage. So put that aside, and then imagine another situation where, for why multilateralism is needed. Some of you may know an NGO leader by the name of Robert Suber. He's quite notorious in meetings at the Security Council. The ambassador, he may know Robert. And here's one quote I'd like to use for this one. He says, one of the reasons that we value multilateral policy spaces is that it does bring out progressive impulses in delegations that might not play so well at home. Those same impulses, however, can at times mask domestic concerns that would do well to receive more concerted international attention. For example, the delegations, for instance, that champion peace in UN conference room, while their capital counterparts are laying plans to bomb civilians, arrest journalists, suspend constitutional freedoms, or otherwise undermine the rule of law. Now, that's an indictment as well as an excitement about the multilateral space. But if we are imagining the multilateral space like the United Nations as an alternative locus for the articulation of progressive impulses that otherwise public servants at home when they go abroad cannot say, that again becomes more, it makes the multilateral space exciting for NGOs. That's why the NGOs have evolved what used to be called shadow reports. That governments, the first UN come to the UN and speak of how good it is at home, until the NGO exposes in a shadow report that it is not really as rosy as the paragraphs in the report show. And so, for lack of a term, the love-hate relationship of the very citizenry about which we want to bring to the multilateral table, education for global citizenship, the grassroots and the NGOs. The other thing that I'd like to talk about is something related to this year's focus of Kyung-hee University, which is the focus on civilizational shifts as well as transformative shifts. I think a revisiting of the multilateral platform and a revisiting of the United Nations based on state frameworks or statist frameworks, as long as and until we revisit that, the so-called sovereign equality of nation states. Now imagine for a moment, and I'm talking of a specific country, the husband is the ambassador, the wife is the deputy ambassador, the two children as the first and the second secretary, the grandchildren are the janitors of the mission offices. They are just too happy when NGOs like us offer to them our research capability. We will do the research for you. What do you need? We will provide space for you to come and, Now, talk about sovereign equality of states. There are so many states that are less than 10 in the staff complement, from ambassador down to the janitor, compared to other states that have more than 100 or 200 staff at their beck and call. And so again, the value of the third UN is important and yet is underappreciated in the formal settings of the United Nations. The third and last, I do have a lot of notes here, but the third and last is something that I mentioned yesterday, which is on many large issues that are discussed at the global front, it's not the NGOs. So this is a self-critique of my own practice. It's not the NGOs that's bringing them to the United Nations, or it's not the NGOs that come to the UN that are most critical in the provision of solutions. Say, for example, on the Korean issue in the peninsula. The non-governmental organizations from Korea are not coming to the UN to talk about the peninsula issues. They address the SDGs, they address the other issues. So I think there's a missing element in the combination of third UN, I may call the forces that make up the third UN. NGO is a very technical term at the UN. Article 71, providing for ECOSOC to make arrangements for NGOs to be able to make interventions at the UN. And therefore, the ECOSOC consultative status. Never mind for now the associated status with respect to the DPI. But that representation is a very specialized one, NGO, until another term came in, which is CSO, civil society organizations. And it became much more amorphous. And for me, I critique it as a practice from within NGO communities, but I also critique it from the perspective of the second UN. The critique being that the amorphous, wider CSO configuration is one way for the Secretariat at the UN to handle the issue of inclusion and diversity, and yet they countered it with another formula called multi-stakeholderism, which is, you NGOs have become much bigger, we do not have enough staff, we cannot handle you anymore, and so you police your own ranks, so let's go to a high-level political forum, NGO major groups. So you police your own ranks, you organize yourselves, and then in the end, high-level meeting on migration, they will say, it's about migrants and refugees, but we will only have 3 speakers of migrants and refugees. And then 24 hours before the meeting, the 3 were reduced to 1. Because 2 heads of state who did not say they were coming the day before suddenly came. But this is high-level meeting on migrants and refugees. And of more than 100 speakers, only 3 migrants and refugees were going to speak. And then because of the priority of the first UN, the third UN, but the third UN this time is about them, it's migrants and refugees, eventually reduced to 3. I'm partly trivializing, but I'm also giving you a picture of, I think, the kind of interaction that the characterization of first, second, and third UN brings, the kind of challenges that the book and Tom raises, both in the theory as well as in the practice of multilateralism. I stop there for now.
All right, thanks.
It's a very rich and fascinating discussion, and Tom, I'd like to thank you for writing the book, which I did read thoroughly before I got here, and I'm glad I had that opportunity and would encourage all of you who haven't to do so. And Dr. Cho for putting this on the agenda. I think it's wonderful. It's very interesting to hear the comments because everybody's commenting from a very valid, unique perspective about this because there is no one perspective. Are we talking short-term or long-term? Are we talking organizational improvement or are we talking human accomplishment? They're all valid perspectives. And I'm going to try to frame my comments from a different perspective, simply to complement, not to in any way contradict what I've heard. Huh? Yes, 5 minutes. Okay. You're anxious about that. Okay, friend. I think it's important as one of those perspectives, that we don't look at this from the US point of view or what Donald Trump's going to do this year, and we don't know what's going to happen in November, or even if whatever happens, we don't know what's going to happen 2 years from now. And this discussion is too important to be limited to the US or its president. I think it's too important to be limited to the UN, and those of you who've had rich experience, which I have not had in the UN, and that's why I find it so fascinating to listen to. So I'd like to comment from what I'd call a historical perspective, an evolutionary perspective, and time permitting, an organizational perspective, because that's the kind of work I do. At first, simple conclusion, I fully agree with Irina. I think there is no other way forward, period. And just to document that, and Tom, you have done it in your book, but I think it can be done much more strongly. The movement to diplomacy means the movement off of the battlefield into the conference room. And the UN is the first really effective organization that we've done that in human history on a global scale. And that is itself enough of an accomplishment to justify the future. We have to remember, at the time the UN was founded, 1/3 of humanity was living under colonial rule with no basic human rights. And that has been abolished, essentially, effectively, by the formation of the UN. War has been, for the kind of war what we really have gone through and know what it means, we have at least, if not abolished it, avoided it, which is an incredible accomplishment. The UNDP said 20 years ago, the world has developed more in the last 50 years than in the previous 500. And certainly it's much more true today than it was 20 years ago. And that could not have happened without the UN, and Tom has spoken to much of that. The importance of individual rights. We did not have any spokesman of individual rights in the world as an effective agency before the UN. I used to grow up thinking that we were in America a spokesman, but this was the human rights of some people that didn't include women until my grandmother fought for suffrage with the suffragettes, and didn't include blacks until much longer. We live in a different world because of the UN, and I think it's important. The UN has not only affirmed rights, it's affirmed the collective responsibility of humanity, which we're very ineffectively carrying out to our frustration and discontent, rightfully so. But the idea that we're collectively responsible itself is a new idea. And of course, the multilateralism, which has been referred to, and the idea of global rule of law. I can't think of any of these achievements have being possible or being sustainable without an organization like this, or much, much better than this, which is obviously what we all want. I mentioned yesterday that the challenges confronting humanity, none of them can be done on a unilateral level. None of them can be handled on a bilateral level. We simply don't have any choice. But so that only increases the frustration. We all agree on that, but so what? What are we going to do about it? Isn't that it? I think it's important to understand that the problem we face is not just an organizational problem. As much as I sympathize and would be frustrated if it was my job to organize this place, the UN, in one respect, may be more closely analogous to a marketplace than the organization in the way where we think that somebody's got authority and they act from down. Nobody really has the authority here. There's no owner. The countries are, as Tom has emphasized, each looking out for their own interests in this. We don't have anything that fits organizational theory that you can manage this because there are so many forces addressing. And what we need is an evolution to that. And I think that's the question. If we look at the problems not as so much personal inefficiency, and that's there, abundantly political recalcitrance, and that's there, but look at it in an evolutionary point of view, look at the conditions that we need in order to have global institutions where there will really be that solid support. And I would add we need another chapter or section of this report on the fourth UN, which you might rightly say doesn't exist yet, because as much I'm part of the UN, of the civil society organizations, but I think we know we don't represent all of humanity, and we don't represent all of the constituents in this. One other point, I think the structure of the UN, the functioning of the Security Council, the veto, to me is an atrocious abnormality, and yet I think historically I can't imagine that we would have ever had this institution if we hadn't arranged that this very imbalanced, unequal way of starting. And the question is not, the question is how do we go beyond it? And that raises a fundamental evolutionary question as to how power is going to be distributed in society. And my own reading is that what we're facing today is a struggle for power, for social power, not just military or organizational power, between those who know we have to move forward and those who have held on to the power and are trying to do that. And the US, which was a leader in one direction, I think has become a leader in the other, and that's one of the problems of being a superpower without opposition. It's who has ever given up power when it's in your hands. But it goes much further. It goes down into the power of money in the world today. We're not going to solve that today. But until money gets out of government, until we cease having the plutocracies and get to real democracies that really reflect what the people want, we're going to have problems in the UN. We're not going to be able to solve them in New York, though I think there's much can be done to improve on it. I think one of the problems today is it's very hard to think of anything but Donald Trump, except North Korea. Now we have something positive to think about for a moment. But I think that's, I look at it as this is a reaction to the inevitable forward movement. And we have to think beyond the reaction and not get discouraged by it, because it's going to reverse itself as other reactions have in the past. And I don't have time to illustrate, but very good examples of when things really got worse and seemed to be going in the other direction before they finally got much better. I made and I know I'm at my time, so I will just end with one more comment. I said there's a fourth UN or a fourth party that has to be. I think the real solution for the UN, or one of the key things, is we're going to have to find some ways to give a voice to human sovereignty. We've been fighting for national sovereignty, and I think we're all aware that nation states don't represent their own people, let alone the rest of the world. And nation states, in my country, it represents political parties and professional career politicians to a very large extent, and business interests, especially when we're dealing with other countries, it doesn't represent. And we don't have any agencies. The NGOs are the closest we come to it, and I think they're invaluable. But we don't have anybody with the credibility to really say we represent the voice of humanity, or the we the people that's there in the Charter. And I was discussing with Liberato yesterday an idea. It's a far out idea, and it certainly is not going to solve all the problems. But I think we need to think about how we engage a voice of humanity beyond the nation state, just like, and there are different ways, like the idea of a world parliament, which has been a UN parliament, which has been pushed by a lot of people, like Europe has done, getting from the national parliaments to a European parliament. But even beyond that, we don't even know what global public opinion is. And that's the protection of the nation state, that we don't even know really what American public opinion is, or national public opinion on a lot of issues. And even when we do, it's ignored to a very large extent. But what about global public opinion? Don't we really have a say in, when an issue like climate change, every human being has a stake in this, and yet we're not allowing every human being to log in or even to give a voice to it. I think there are mechanisms that can be developed to do that, ideally within the UN, but I don't see that happening, maybe initially outside the UN until the UN or some other agency takes it forward. Thanks for your
All right, thank you. I'm losing my credibility as a timekeeper. Okay. Anyway, thank you. Professor Ojun.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Ruiz, for your for coming up with your new book. Actually, when I met him first a few days back, I said, "Your name sounds familiar. I must have read your book. What did you write?" And he said, "You know, he wrote quite a number of books, so he can't specify." And I forgot either, but it was good. And thank you for coming with another good book. The question, the title of your book, the question your book is posing is very thought-provoking, I think, especially for those of us who have been engaged in the United Nations and multilateralism in our career. Well, I think the question is not really about a world without the United Nations. It's more like a world without a United Nations, because if we have the United Nations, we must have created another universal organization with a different name. So it's about a United Nation. If there is no United Nation at all, if there is no multilateralism at all, then what would the world be like? I think the world will be more chaotic and problematic, mainly because we are living in a world which is getting globalized very fast. So we need global governance, and we don't have global government. Then you need an organization like the United Nations, where all the countries gather and try to provide sort of global governance. In some areas, we are quite successful in getting global governance. In some areas, not. But whether you like globalization or not, you know, globalization is irreversible. You know, these days I think people like the adjective irreversible so much, so they put it to everything. But actually, globalization, if you think about it, is one way. You cannot make the world which we had in the past, where it took 2 months to cross the Atlantic. To cross the Atlantic, it takes 5 hours. You cannot go back. It's irreversible. It's one way. So as long as we have globalization, and globalization is not bringing benefits or need, it creates or exacerbates a lot of problems. You need global governance, and you need multilateralism. But multilateralism is not thriving as it should be. Why not? In my opinion, because of the discrepancy between what is called the principle of sovereign equality and the international reality, reality of power politics. If one country, like the United States, had been so powerful that it virtually rules the world, then I think we might not have too many problems. We have world government. Whether you like United States or not, we have world government. But the United States is not so powerful. Not that powerful. It is powerful. But if you think about this principle of sovereign equality, came up in 17th century, in my opinion, for the convenience of European states. You know, they wanted to respect small states, because if big states keep invading small states, Europe was going to be very chaotic. So they wanted some order, and they came out with this idea of sovereign equality. But how come states are equal? You know, Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Bautista also mentioned that. You know, humans are equal, not states are equal. If states are equal and they have equal power, that means that country with large population has a problem. You know, the people living in China is very weak, because their country with 1.3 billion population has the same sovereign right as country with 30,000 people in the Pacific. So actually, humans should be equal, not states. But we have this principle of sovereign equality for 300 years. We cannot change it. And the reality, international reality is such that, you know, not only population, but in terms of national power, we have a big difference among all these states. And this discrepancy between principle of sovereign equality and international reality is one of the biggest hurdles we're going to have to overcome if we want to have a world government. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Professor Moon.
How many minutes do I have? We do not
The
have
shorter,
a
the
sovereign
better.
equality, right? Okay, so yeah, first of all, okay, congratulate your new book, and I really enjoyed, okay, your the various kind of information and insight and some sources for a further thinking on these topics. Actually, I'm not a secretariat or what you call the second UN that said in the steps in the UN. I'm not even some civil organizations, NGOs, okay? So I'm just a professor. But in a broad sense, I'm probably part of a third UN in your term, right? But what I usually related to the United Nations or some other these issues is I teach a international organization course. And in that course, we usually read the UN Charter, okay, the sentence by sentence, and then we also go to some field trip to the Geneva or a UN headquarters, but like a tourist, okay, taking pictures, shaking hands. That's probably that I and my students usually do. But it's quite great experience, especially for students. So for that course, as well as the professor teaches those courses, okay, I really want to invite all of you sometime, okay, next semester in my course, okay, as a special guest lecturer, especially with, okay, your presentation will be a great addition for my lecture. So simple comments on your book, okay, as you want, okay, some good things, okay, some nice things about the book is that when I read that book, okay, like other books usually have some practical information as well as closeness to the international organizations or introductions, okay, this book gives some big pictures or the theoretical perspectives. So that will be a good asset, okay, for the IR students or the political scientists by reading this book with certain theoretical perspectives and applying those things, the actual examples of United Nations. And I also think that your terms, you coined the terms of first, second, third UN. Now that is a kind of commonsensically, commonly used terms, academia as well as some practical society, and that will be the significant contribution, okay, for the students of the UN studies. And when the Professor Chong asked me to participate as discussion here, then I was thinking about, in preparing this conference, what is my role in this, okay, this discussion? He probably asked me to play some kind of devil's advocate type of things, because everyone says that what kind of achievements we have so far with the UN, how we can make a significant kind of improvements using UN. So probably he asked me that of course there has been any sensible man, okay, except for Donald Trump, okay, who can deny that the contribution and value addedness of United Nations for mankind. So as a devil's advocate, okay, I should say that there is some still negative or suspicious aspects of United Nations, okay, and its future. And of course, okay, I fully understand, I fully agree with your arguments that we probably have lived and lives and will live in a much, okay, the desperate, disastrous, and repressive kind of world without UN. However, when we say that we expect some functions and some goals and missions of United Nations, okay, we set a very high standard at the early period of UN's establishment. And then, after the Cold War, and nothing's worked. It means that there has been some block competition and blockade, there's nothing works. And then the revival of the United Nations, revival of the hopes of international community, that was immediately after the Cold War, end of Cold War. That was time that the Gulf War and the United Nations, under the leadership of the United Nations, they intervened in the Saddam Hussein's the aggression to Kuwait, and they actually seem to establish some ideas of collective securities, right? Now there had been a very high hopes on that, but later those hopes and high aspirations seems to wither in one aspect or the other. So, big question probably we can think of is that where we are located and where we are heading right now. If we think that if our UN is moving toward some kind of a post-World War II, Cold War style, some kind of impotent and blocked, and blocked and stalemated United Nations, that they can actually do that much things because of two major powers or two major blocks compete with each other or fight with each other, or some serious rivalries existed in there. That was the one question that we can think of when the China rising things and United States declining things, and then Donald Trump's, that symptom that reflects some of the return to nationalism, national interest first, and then as many realists suggest, this is a kind of Thucydides trap type of thing. So if those kind of big rivalries and big contentious and then rivalrous atmosphere continue to evolve, then probably what we can expect about the United Nations is just the kind of inertia of what they have done so far and no more progress, So that might be some worst case scenario we can think of. And I think that is not a joke anymore, and that is quite high probable scenario that we can see if the United States or the China is they collide with each other head to head and continuous kind of struggles, not just in the United Nations, but also in the WTO or international organization. That will be some stalemated, deadlock situations of United Nations. Or even worse, there might be even the worst scenario that as many realists, Allison or the University of Chicago, the John Mearsheimer said that in this power transition period, war is inevitable type of some negative and pessimistic view of the realism says, then probably the most important and the most emergent kind of new goals, repeat of the goals of United Nations is what the United Nations was established in 1945. That was how to avoid, how to maintain international peace and security. Here, this international peace and security is not about a peacekeeping operations. This is not about some human aid things. That was how to avoid major war, as well as how to make the mankind survival. That is, I don't think that pessimistic scenario would be an inevitable path, but probably if we cannot control, or we cannot mitigate some of these tensions, then we probably see that what we never had witnessed for last 50 years. We have lived, even though there have been many limitations and weaknesses, but UN functioned quite successfully, and they broadened their issues quite significantly, and that makes actual contribution to us. But now it's time that we may think about whether that is given to us or not. My suggestion for this is that I think that the United Nations and they are dealing with a very different issues in a very different ways. So, for example, you said that you give some 3 hypothetical scenarios. One is about the human rights issues, or the humanitarian aid issues. The other is some sustainable development or the economic cooperation issues. The third one issue is about according to your thing, it's the global public good. That was about a global warming that we discussed the day before yesterday and yesterday, how to provide the global public good. I think that the different kind of problems asks a different kind of solutions and different kind of approaches, and probably that requires more fundamental kind of rethinking of how to revitalize, how to regrow, how to create new governances of United Nations. Of course, I'm not an expert in the detailed aspects of United Nations, so probably the more practical answers and solutions probably will be given by some actual participants of these things. But as a professor, I just want to raise some big questions that we need to think more.
All right, very good. Thank you, Simon. it's your turn. You have plenty of tons of questions and comments, but I hope that you would like to give some chances to
Oh, no, no,
students. Or, all right.
I'm tired of hearing myself talk, but let me just take a few things. From a very rich discussion, I'd have to say, the students in the room, you know, there's so many things on the table. One of my colleagues says this is like drinking champagne with a fire hose. It's a little hard to take all of this in. But let me just try to pull a few things from the conversation. Rena, you started out by saying, and this is certainly one of the things that I try to do in some of my other work, that well, there's nothing that's not on the agenda. Let's put it that way. And it's impossible to get things that enter on the agenda off the agenda. It seems to me that you have to throw this back on the member states. Nobody wants to take anything off the agenda. And somehow one has to get beyond every year treating all of the same subjects and let the more important ones at least bubble to the top so that you can spend a little more time on them and focus. Part of as I say more, my work on the development system revolves around trying to think about operationally, what is it that one can do where there's a comparative advantage? In terms of ideas, norms, principles, and standards, that's where I think the UN has a clear comparative advantage in convening and putting together what only a universal institution can put together. In an operational way, it has very few comparative advantages in all countries. In fact, it's perfectly absurd to think that there are technical assistance activities going on in 135 or 40 developing countries. Once again, those member states don't want to lose. Brazil is an emerging power, but we still got to have the UN operational in case there's a flood or God knows what else. I mean, it's clear that over time, operationally, what the UN's been doing for a long time, it can't continue to do everywhere. It has to pick and choose. And I would say that the comparative advantage in operational, not ideational, is in conflict-prone states. The UN is the only place that puts together A to Z. You have military and police assistance, you have humanitarian assistance, you have post-conflict peace building, and eventually, hopefully, back to development. Nobody else can put that together, and it seems to me that the notion, peace building writ large, is where operationally the system will have to go, as opposed to frittering away efforts everywhere. Not on the ideational front, but on the operational front. For both Levy and Gary, sorry about the jargon, but for those of you who go back and look at the history of international relations, at first, most analysts and lawyers in particular, but also political scientists, talked about member states, that the UN was about member states. And Ines Claude, a kind of breakthrough, said, well, whoa, it's not just the people who pay the bills, or sometimes pay the bill, who are there. That's the first UN. He added this notion that there are international civil servants, the top officials, and the people who work for them. And I think too many people thought of that as a kind of master-slave relationship, a principal agent, in which the civil servants saluted, and that was the end of the story. I think what happened over time is there was far too little attention paid to how independent actors can act. And one of the things I said, as long as we're going to have confessions, one of the things I said is that I would never work for the UN, and then one of the first things I ended up doing was working for the UN. And in my dissertation, I talked about the problems of individual being powerless. And one of the first things I learned after getting into the Secretariat was how much room for maneuver even a junior official had, and what a difference I could make in sort of certain kinds of research, monitoring, and even some field activities. So there's the first UN and the second UN. But then one of the major research projects, and this, maybe you were talking about the third UN, we might as well define it. When I was trying to do an intellectual history of the United Nations with my colleagues, Sir Richard Jolly and Louis Emery, and 17 books we commissioned, et cetera, we found out that we actually couldn't explain breakthroughs and new norms and new ideas without a lot of other people in the room. NGOs were one of them, international commissions, various kinds of experts, even, God help us, academics occasionally, who made a difference. You couldn't actually explain breakthroughs without involving them, so we labeled this the third UN. And actually, I'm now working on a book because that article, which we wrote about 8 years ago, is one of the most widely cited pieces, but I sort of got distracted and did other things. I'm actually going to do a book on the politics of knowledge and norm production, which is really going to be exclusively about the third UN, because I think you can't explain lots of things without relying upon that. At one point, and this, I said this in response to your question yesterday, that I actually think that they're not in my lifetime, but there's going to have to be a third generation of international organizations. If the League was one and the UN was the second. Not anytime soon, but it's clear that there are certain problems that are going to need something like a overarching authority. Not all problems, but certain problems. And one of the real problems for me is that in explaining the Congress of Vienna, explaining the League, and explaining the UN, as I said yesterday, the way these things result is from catastrophic wars. There doesn't seem to be anything else that moves. States just temporarily set aside that hypocrisy we call sovereign equality and national interest to move beyond. So I keep looking for some way to move toward at least providing certain kinds of global public goods. We're not doing very well, but that's what's on my very crowded agenda. The final thing that I would say, and this I think grows out of your comments, in the criticism I would make of most social scientists is how ahistorical we've been. We're not quite as bad as politicians, for whom the forward planning consists of the next 2 weeks, and history consists of the last public opinion poll. But there's a whole lot of that in contemporary social science, and we really need, I think, to go back farther. So my sort of efforts at global governance, because the term grew up with the first use of the term was actually in 1992 with Jim Rosenau and Ernst Champill's book on global governance. The journal was founded in 1995. But it's so associated with the post-Cold War moment that we don't sort of go back and think about what lessons, what kinds of elements were there of global governance, the 19th century, 18th century. So there are lots of elements and lots of lessons to be learned. So I think one of the real challenges for students and analysts of global governance is trying to go back and look for those lessons. I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thank you. I know that, our discussants have more comments and questions right now, but let's give a chance to our audience, okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, any questions from our professors or? Okay, Professor Cohen. You can use the microphone there.
I had the honor of the pleasure of holding the copies, from the as a gift from Tom, and reading the pleasure. So I had a personal, questions that I had to, ask to Tom before it's too late. And there is, and also in a way to enliven our discussions, and particularly for the public Korean audiences, that he was a little bit critical about Ban Ki-moon leaderships. So as I remind you, there may be reasons why you actually, his whole book ends with recommendations, a suggestion how to reform the UN systems. And he emphasized that to do so, you have to have strong leaderships and the step efficiency. You have to be effective and efficient. Again, the cadet civil servant has to be very capable of providing services. So in those two regards, in that context, he was a little bit of critical of Ban Ki-moon, and then he had high expectation, very high expectation on the current Secretary General Guterres, and he gave the very good marks, evaluations, and Kofi Annan. So that's one question I throwing to you to engage all the other. Actually, many of you will serve the UN under Ban Ki-moon leaderships, so there will be many comments you can exchange. The other thing is that actually he is very critical of the SDG.
Of the?
SDGs, actually, in terms of organizing agendas and trying to address them. He was preferred, actually, MDG approaches over SDG approaches. And that, again, might be some point you can exchange comments and opinions.
Okay. Let us get a few more questions. There are some. Oh, Professor O? Yeah, and then how about our students? If you have any question about any aspects of United Nations, I hope that you raise your hands. Okay, Professor O first. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is related to very small issue, the climate change. And it was very slow to get the actions or the outcomes from the UN system to solve the problem, like climate change. And consequently, there have been some the regional and decentralized mitigation actions. They are basically based on the bilateral agreement between two member states. And for example, the JCM structured by the Japan, which is very similar to the CDM under the Kyoto Protocol, but it was not verified by UN system. And right now, under the Paris agreements, it seems to allow the decentralized approaches, but there is no guideline from the UN. As a result, the member states is waiting, and they are hesitant to get some actions with the developing countries. So, and again, the UN's decision-making system, which is based on consensus-based decision-making system, and also it is pretty large scale, the global decision-making, which is basically it's very slow to solve the very timely issues. So my question is, I want to hear what is your opinion about the relationship between the UN and the sub or the club activities.
I'm sorry, between the UN and the?
Club activities. It's not UN, but some actions based on
Small
bilateral
countries.
agreements. Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
Not sure.
Okay. I'm expecting some questions from our students. No? All right. Okay, very quick.
I wanted to take this opportunity to include another discussion because Ambassador O will remember that I've been in conversations with you together with the working group on education for global citizenship, and I've had long discussions with Ambassador Han before you both left New York. And because it is in the setting of the university, I remember probably about 8 or 9 years ago in this same room, we were discussing about the role of the university in these transformative and civilizational shifts. And we've already started talking about education for global citizenship. And I think that is one contribution that Korea has offered to the world, if I might say, in terms of a reimagination of what civics might look like. And Kyung Hee had, again, another discussion some time ago about what constitutes civics, and that was the World Civic Forum. So if we're going to prosper a new imagination of the international, I was discussing this with Thomas yesterday, a reconstitution of the international where the nationals matter as much as the nation state. So the nationals meaning the peoples, which is really what we the peoples mean. And I think there is an obligation, I call it obligation, of the university to help undergird what would make a true education for global citizenship. Now, after having said that, I do have certain questions about the formulation global citizenship, because the very term itself is saddled with the statist framework. It refers to citizenship. If we're going to talk about issues of global commons, of global issues like climate change, perhaps it should be called education for planetary citizenship, so that the trajectory is not it does not have the baggage of 1648 Westphalia, but it shoots up to the skies and to the cosmos, to that of the planet. And the whole discussion that is, I think, exciting today is that the UN must deal no longer just about people, i.e. human rights and human dignity and its anthropocentric trajectory, but also care for the planet. I mean, in the words of the Pope, people and the planet. And therefore, the citizenship that is needed must be unyoked from decoupled, I must say, from the statist framework to a more planetary understanding, so that the human rights and earth rights are coupled. And I think that is not to disregard the sovereignty question, but not to saddle the people and planet question with the statist framework. And I think they can simultaneously happen.
Okay. All right. It's almost.
No comment.
Okay.
I'm sure that there will be others also who, but just a very, very small comment to the last intervention by Liberato. I think it's important because as long as UNESCO was working, of course, with Korea so much on the global citizenship education, when we supported the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in his Education First initiative in 2013, we were working on what are those very important pillars of education for the future. And we were thinking about access to education, quality, but the third, it's about values. It's about what kind of people, global citizens, not strictly in the limited, I would say, understanding that, if you allow me, but the global at the global citizens that they have to be. And this is this notion of global citizenship education that emerged, and we inscribed it into the goal number 4, which is number 7 of the targets of the goal number 4, where the first such reflection meeting was here in Korea, and Korea was so much helpful in New York and others to inscribe it there. So I think this is exactly what you started with, one of those forward-looking ideas that could bridge, that could marry the necessity of a citizen to be educated, to be knowledgeable about, but broaden the scope of his or her understanding about the world, because otherwise we will not be in a position neither to change mentalities in terms of climate, because we talk about climate, but also about living together. Another very big concept that nowadays has to be also transcend national borders with the globalization, connectivity, and everything that is there. So I just want to put it in a different perspective, this notion about education for global citizenship, which I think it's a great idea.
Just one quick comment to what Irina just said. Sustainable Development Goals is about leaving no one behind, but also putting people and planet at the center. So we have already planetary agenda in SDGs.
I just wanted to come back to the statement that was made that as if to imply that national sovereignty hasn't changed. I think it would be right to see that national sovereignty has dramatically changed over time, and it is much less powerful today than it was in the past. Corporations have more power today. Human beings in the internet have more power today. There are many. Civil society has thousands of organizations have much more power. I'm only mentioning it. It's not as if national sovereignty has stayed still since the Treaty of Westphalia, and it's not moving. It is moving, but it's got to move much further than it is.
Okay. Tom.
How many hours do I have?
All night.
You want to skip dinner? It's okay?
That's probably not on my agenda, but, well, in no particular order here. I'm just going to start with Gary's last point here. The discussions of sovereignty have always implied that it was absolute and et cetera. And it never, this is one thing that Boutros-Ghali said, it's never been absolute and never will be absolute. And one of the best books written on that was called, by Steve Krasner, called Organized Hypocrisy, because whether you're looking at the law, whether you're looking at diplomacy, whether you're looking about keeping economic influences, whatever you're looking at, there's always been less than absolute sovereignty. However, that being said, member states are still the most important guarantee of everything from human rights to economic stability. And you'd be silly if you were an international relations analyst to try to pretend that they were going to disappear anytime soon. That wouldn't be good for your career, and you'd be wrong. Let me come around to, I'm not sure I got all of the climate change questions. For me, in distinguishing these ideational and operational roles, I really think there's not much the UN can do operationally. I mean, if you look at how many resources, how few resources, there's probably no topic on which the relationship between money and the nature of the problem is bigger. On the other hand, one of the best examples, I think, of what the UN can do is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which over a relatively short period of time, starting in 1987, I think, pulling together world-class scientists changed the conversation in most spots, not yet in Washington, D.C., but changed the conversations about climate change. And for me, that's the kind of comparative advantage that the UN system enjoys. Now, well, let me come around to Jibong. You see, the problem with giving him something to read is he found 3 typos in the book, which really irritated me. But yes, and you got one too. Jesus. Okay. I just published a piece this morning on in Past Blue on my profound disappointment, I think is what I would say, with what Antonio Guterres has done to date. Now, I may, in my usual way, be impatient and have way too high expectations for everything, but I'm sure over a glass of wine, Irina will tell us some war stories about the campaign. But it seemed to me that the campaign was, for the first time, one opened the window just ever so slightly on more openness and transparency toward candidates. There was some public debate, there were some vision statements, there were some informal meetings, and so for the first time, it was not, it didn't resemble necessarily a papal conclave. When the white smoke came out of the Security Council, there had been some vetting, and I think that there already has been a sort of impact on the selection of the head of the WHO and the head of UNESCO in terms of a similar kind of opening the window a little bit, and I'd like to see a lot more of that for positions everywhere. And one of the important things for me in the selection process was that geographical rotation was not the end of the story as it has been in the past. And I found my own criticisms of the civil service, there's way too much reliance on nationality as a criteria for recruitment at every single level. So, that said, this op-ed I wrote basically said that to date, there's actually been some moving around of the UN organogram, which is very technical and technocratic, without any big vision. And that's not going to excite anybody. Not even UN geeks are going to get excited by that. So, in short, for me, one of the most important roles of the Secretary General is as the occupant of the bully pulpit. And it's hard to occupy that if you want to have friends. Particularly if you think that you need 193. So one of the real problems, I think, and those who can comment on this later, is that one of the most important demands I thought of the 1 for 7 billion is one term, 6 years, 7 years, I don't, anyway, so that from day one, the Secretary General is not like U.S. congressmen are running for office. It's, we got elected today, it's now time to run for the next thing, and setting aside what actually can be done. I'm not as keen as lots of my colleagues on the SDGs. We use the term here, there's nothing that's not on the agenda. Well, if you want to see an illustration of that, for me, it's the SDGs. So one of the, I think, the real advantages of the MDGs was that they were put together by a small group. That's one of the disadvantages of secretariat officials from the second UN. It wasn't a smoke-filled room because there already were no cigarettes in UN conference rooms back then. But it pulled together everything that had been agreed in a huge number of other global forums. The time constraints and the specificity of most of the criteria, I thought were an effective device to partially hold member states' feet to the fire. The SDGs, in many ways, are the opposite. 169, some people say 229 and counting indicators, which means that any member state can pick and choose. Even Switzerland couldn't perform on all those indicators. Their advantage, of course, is that they apply to all countries. The way they were formulated, involving many members of the third UN and many members of the second end, everybody's hobby horse is there. There's no sense of priority. There is no sequencing. It's all over the map. So, while I think it's terrific that everyone has an SDG pin in his lapel, I don't, and there's SDG soccer balls being kicked in Geneva, I don't see this necessarily as a big step forward.
Thank you.
Okay, now we get to.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
30 seconds.
probably we're outside, but I really wanted very quickly to, first because the question was about the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, and I think I can speak. I was not appointed by him. I did not serve under him. I was elected by member states. I was totally independent, part of this UN family, as they said, UN system. That is why I think I'm free also to say it, that I think it's not an overstatement to say that history will be much more fair to him. I think what he did in the terms of climate, because we speak about now Paris Agreement, but we sometimes forget that the Secretary General Ban pushed this agenda strongly, even risking at some points. I remember when there was once this meeting 2 years before or a year before Paris, because there was a lot of hesitation, it's going to happen, it's not going to happen. He risked his political credibility in order to convene this summit in New York. Yes, right. And then the same was, I remember, with the Rio Plus 20 conference. It was all on the verge of collapsing, and he put all his weight, also with other leaders, not to speak about, and I think in his second term, he was very outspoken on many sensitive, I would say, political issues. So I believe we should give credit to his leadership and to his legacy. So I think we should be more fair to what he did in reality in the United, and I think history will judge him rightfully.
Okay.
On the SDGs, it's only one thing. I agree with you, Thomas, but I think the MDGs would never have worked more because SDGs are owned by governments, and development comes from within. It's not charity, it's policy. It's policy from within. This is my experience.
I guess you have most of, at least South Koreans behind you on this specific point, okay? So, I mean, it's okay. I feel that I have to...
respond.
No, okay.
No. You already said a lot, and we have some Ban Ki-moon followers here, so give him a chance. All right. Instead, I will read your conclusion. Okay. Okay. So, would the world be better without the UN? His conclusion: no, the world would not be better without the United Nations. Yes, the world could be better with a more creative and robust United Nations. We agree, right? Yeah. So most of us are with you on this point, okay? Let me close this session. Thank you so much, especially Tom and our commentators and some professors and the students. I really appreciate your attendance and attention to this session. Thank you.